Perhaps more so than any other genre, horror is able to get away with being familiar and formulaic, because the thrill of watching a group of hapless young people fecklessly flee a mask-wearing, blade-wielding maniac is just inherently fun, you know? But that doesn't mean the genre is stagnant or lacking in original takes, as there are many filmmakers who like to switch up the expected clichés and tropes. So, with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with What Culture, here with horror movie characters who didn't know they were the victim. Jacob Singer in Jacob's Ladder. Let's kick the list off with a surefire cult classic, 1990s unforgettable psychological horror Jacob's Ladder. Tim Robbins stars as Jacob Singer, a soldier in the Vietnam War, who in the film's opening scene is stabbed by a bayonet-wielding foe. Jacob wakes up in a New York City subway several years later, and the rest of the movie plays out with him experiencing increasingly disturbing visions of the world around him. At film's end, however, it's revealed that Jacob is still very much in Vietnam and living out his final moments following that opening bayonet attack. Worse still, the attacker was one of his own men who was driven insane by a drug called the Ladder that was being secretly tested out by the army on Jacob's unit. Almost the entirety of the movie has been Jacob's dying vision, including a comforting final image of his dead son leading him towards a bright light, before we cut abruptly to Vietnam where Jacob is declared dead. Malcolm Crowe in The Sixth Sense. There's perhaps no greater or more iconic instance of a character who doesn't realise they're the victim of a horrible death than The Sixth Sense's protagonist Malcolm Crowe. At the start of the film, Malcolm returns home with his wife Anna, only to be confronted by a disturbed former patient, Vincent Gray, who has broken into their home. Vincent angrily accuses Malcolm of failing him during his treatments as a child before shooting Malcolm and then himself. We then jump forward months later where Malcolm has seemingly recovered from his injuries and goes about treating his new patient, Cole Sear. Except, of course, the jaw-dropping twist at film's end is that Malcolm never survived being shot by Vincent, and has in fact been dead the entire time he's been working with Cole. When Cole told Malcolm that he could see dead people, he was speaking in far more direct terms than Malcolm ever realised. Malcolm's wife appears distant throughout the film because she literally can't see him, though Malcolm at least manages to make peace with her and move on at the end. Mary Henry in Carnival of Souls. The legendary 1962 indie horror Carnival of Souls opens with protagonist Mary Henry taking part in a road race with her friends, but disaster strikes when the other car nudges Mary's, causing it to plunge off a bridge and into a river. Hours later, Mary emerges without any memory of how she made it out alive. The story quickly moves forward as Mary finds herself beset by increasingly disturbing visions, particularly of a ghoulish stranger and the recurring image of a pavilion which she feels inexplicably drawn towards. At film's end, Mary heads to the pavilion and finds the ghoul dancing with an army of fellow ghouls, including a ghoulish version of Mary herself. Mary flees and the ghouls give chase before she collapses. The next day, Mary's car is finally pulled from the river, revealing her corpse in the front seat alongside her friends. She was dead the whole time, though the precise nature of Mary's presence throughout the film is kept intriguingly ambiguous. Everybody in Tales from the Crypt. 1972's Tales from the Crypt anthology film quite ingeniously hid its big twist in plain sight. The wraparound story sees a group of 5 strangers visit some old catacombs and come into contact with the Crypt Keeper, who subsequently details how each of the 5 will die, seemingly in the future. After these short stories have all played out, the Crypt Keeper reveals that they weren't visions of the future, but that each of them has actually already died. The film then ends with them each being led into the fiery pit of hell. Granted, each of these characters were absolute degenerates deserving of eternal damnation, but that doesn't mean they didn't suffer through some absolutely horrific deaths, albeit deaths they only became conscious of in retrospect. Trevor Gooden in Hellraiser Hellseeker. Unsurprisingly, the 6th entry into the Hellraiser franchise is pretty terrible, rocking a coveted 0% on Rotten Tomatoes even. But it nevertheless offers a perfect example of a horror movie protagonist who has no idea they're dead meat already. Protagonist Trevor Gooden is involved in a car accident at the start of the film, which he only scarcely appears to survive, waking up a month later in the hospital. However, Trevor's head injuries have made him unable to differentiate between fantasy and reality, and the movie's increasingly bizarre series of events culminates in the revelation that Trevor actually died at the start of the story. But it wasn't simply a car accident that killed him. Trevor was shot in the head by his wife, franchise legend Kirsty Cotton, who staged it to look like a suicide in revenge for Trevor cheating on her with numerous women and also plotting to kill her. Trevor has actually spent most of the movie in hell, where he's been forced to re-examine his past sins in a limbo-like state. At film's end, his soul becomes the possession of Cenobite Pinhead, while Kirsty seems to get away with killing him scot-free. Obviously, in Trevor's case, he happens to be a giant asshole as well as an unknowing victim, so while we might not have much sympathy for him, he still spends the bulk of the story unaware of his mortal outcome. Adam and Barbara Maitland in Beetlejuice. The film opens with husband and wife Barbara and Adam Maitland driving home when they swerve to avoid a dog and end up careening into a river. Though the car is quickly submerged, Burton abruptly cuts to Barbara and Adam returning home, soaked of course, with Barbara complaining that she feels frozen. Things soon enough get much weirder. Barbara's fingers catch alight like candles, Adam disappears into a desert planet for 2 hours, and neither of them have reflections. Their fate is confirmed a few moments later though, when they find a book in their home entitled Handbook for the Recently Deceased. The couple are dead and spend the rest of the movie trying to have their home's new occupants scared away, courtesy of the bioexorcist Beetlejuice. Unlike most movies on this list, however, Barbara and Adam at least didn't have to wait until the end of the story to figure out their fate. They clocked it in less than 5 minutes. The Johnson family in Haunter. Haunter stars Abigail Breslin as Lisa Johnson, a teenage girl who quickly realizes that she's dead and is forced to repeatedly relive the day that she and her family were murdered in 1985. Unlike Lisa though, her parents and brother don't know they're dead, or consequently that they were the victims of a horrible murder. Only later in the film does Lisa finally break the news to them, and upon accepting their fate, they're able to help her bring down Edgar Mullins, the supernatural serial killer possessing the home's various residents. Ultimately, Lisa has her family move on to the afterlife while she stays behind to finish Edgar, but after doing so she joins them in heaven, having escaped the loop which Mullins trapped them all in. Haunter may not be a great film or nearly as well known as every other movie on this list, but it is an intriguing little horror that offers a neat, unique spin on a superficially familiar concept. Ben Carson in Mirrors. Mirrors is a supernatural horror film revolving around ex-cop Ben Carson, who, while working as a security guard, begins experiencing bizarre visions conjured by a malevolent entity using mirrors to manipulate the physical world. Things go from weird to far worse when his sister is brutally murdered through a mirror, while Ben desperately tries to stop it from preying on the rest of his family. Ben seemingly manages to defeat the demonic force at the end by blowing up the building within which they reside, though Ben is trapped under the rubble when the building collapses. In the film's final scene, Ben manages to free himself from the wreckage and walks through the chaotic remnants, where a body bag is wheeled past, and oddly, nobody seems to acknowledge him. As he looks around, Ben notices that everything is in reverse and he has no reflection, because he actually died in that building explosion and is now trapped in the mirror world. The end. The Stewart family in The Others. 2001's The Others is an expert example of a filmmaker ingeniously turning the haunted house movie on its head. It follows a mother, Grace Stewart, and her 2 young children, Anna and Nicholas, who become convinced that their remote country home is haunted. After a bevy of increasingly creepy stuff unfolds, it's revealed at the end that Grace, her children, and even their servants have actually been dead the whole time. It gets much worse though. Grace lost her mind after her husband's departure for the war and smothered her own kids to death before killing herself. More to the point, the seemingly ghostly others Grace is fearful of throughout the film aren't ghosts at all, but the new owners of the house, whose presence Grace isn't much happy about. While Grace's status as a victim is more complex due to her murderous act, yet she's certainly still a victim of her own mental illness, there's no arguing with the status of her children, who were walking around with no earthly idea that their own mother murdered them. And you think your family dynamic is awkward. Amy Singer in The Devil's Ground. The film opens with a woman, Amy Singer, on the run from a masked machete-wielding maniac. While fleeing, she crosses paths with Carrie Mitchell, who she convinces to take her to the next town. Amy then explains that she's been searching for a Native American burial ground as part of a university project, but the rest of her student group was killed off by the aforementioned serial killer, leaving her the sole survivor. After Amy's story is played out, Carrie stops at a gas station to call the police, but they admonish her for making a prank call, explaining that Amy died 5 years ago. As it turns out, Amy was indeed murdered during her initial encounter, and now exists only as a ghost, appearing on the stretch of road where Carrie picked her up every year on the day that she died. Amy doesn't know she's dead and is inadvertently luring people like Carrie into the killer's trap, yet despite Carrie's best efforts to put a stop to all the carnage, she too falls victim to the killer's blade.
Marion Harrington in Dead End. Dead End takes place on Christmas Eve as Frank Harrington drives his family to his in-laws' home and, out of apparent boredom, decides to take a shortcut through a remote forest area. Already, why? That's such a bad idea. Later, Frank falls asleep at the wheel and very nearly crashes the car into an oncoming vehicle, after which the family finds themselves trapped on a seemingly never-ending road. Throughout the rest of the movie, the family end up being brutally killed one by one while experiencing a bevy of bizarre sights, including a hearse driving down the road. Only Frank's daughter Marion is left alive at film's end, and surprise surprise, she subsequently wakes up in a hospital where it's revealed that she's been in a coma after her father crashed their car, in turn killing every other member of the family. And so, the gruesome deaths suffered by the family members throughout the movie precisely mirror how they died in the actual car crash. Granted, a credit stinger does cast some doubt on what's truly real, given that a note Frank wrote during Marion's comatose dream is recovered from the road in real life, suggesting it wasn't entirely cooked up by Marion's brain. All the same, Marion had no earthly idea what was happening to her until she finally woke up in that hospital. Stack, Ball and Bulldog in Tales from the Hood. Cult fave horror comedy anthology Tales from the Hood is framed by a story of 3 drug dealers, Stack, Ball and Bulldog, arriving at a funeral home to purchase drugs from its unnerving owner, Mr. Sims. Sims then guides the trio through the funeral home to the morgue where the drugs are stored, all while telling stories of some of the corpses in the building. 4 tales later, we finally learn the truth. The 3 men were responsible for killing the subject of one of the stories, a gangster called Crazy K. The trio become agitated as Sims makes it clear he knows what they've done, and when they threaten to kill him, he leads them to 3 caskets, revealing their own corpses inside. Yep! Stack, Ball and Bulldog were actually dead this whole time, as Crazy K's associates killed them in revenge for his murder. More to the point, the funeral home is really hell, and Mr. Sims is actually Satan, who leaves them to burn for all eternity. So, while they absolutely got the ball rolling here by killing Crazy K, they're still unknowing victims in their own right too. Taylor in Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon is a terrific horror mockumentary in which journalist Taylor and her crew follow an aspiring serial killer, Leslie Vernon, as he prepares to embark on a rampage he hopes will put him firmly on the map. Leslie plans out his killing spree to match the conventions of slasher movies, to the extent that his piece de resistance is a showdown with the final girl, a virgin named Kelly. Taylor and her crew ultimately have a crisis of conscience on the night of the massacre and attempt to stop him, knowing the full extent of his plan, or so they think. However, it turns out that Leslie bait and switched them, as Kelly is soon revealed to not be a virgin and therefore not the final girl, moments before she's brutally killed. Taylor then announces that she herself is a virgin, revealing her to be the real final girl as Leslie intended all along. Though in fairness, Leslie's plan always involved him eventually being killed by Taylor, as he is at the end, albeit not before thoroughly terrorising her. The Strangers in the Vault of Horror. 1973's cult British horror anthology film The Vault of Horror follows 5 men who end up trapped in the basement of an office building with seemingly no means of escape. While waiting for help, the gents sit down, pour some drinks, and each regale the group with a tale of a recurring nightmare. Each of the stories play out, and then we return to the men for an epilogue in which the lift door, which has been closed the entire movie, opens, leading out into a graveyard. 4 of the men enter the graveyard and promptly disappear, before the remaining one, Sebastian, reveals that they're actually damned souls whose punishment involved telling the stories, not nightmares, of their evil acts for all of eternity. And at that moment, Sebastian turns back to the room the men were trapped in, revealing it to have been a mausoleum all along. It's an awful fate for anyone, no matter how heinous their acts, but at least they get to drink while reliving their torment nightly, right? John Baxter in Don't Look Now. Don't Look Now is one of the greatest horror films of all time, as married couple John and Laura Baxter head to Venice while grieving the accidental drowning death of their daughter. Once they arrive, 2 elderly clairvoyants inform them that their daughter is attempting to warn them that John is in danger. John, meanwhile, begins witnessing strange, surreal visions, such as a small figure wearing the same red coat his daughter wore when she died, and Laura on a boat that's part of a funeral parade, despite the fact that Laura wasn't even in Venice at this point. At the end of the movie, John again sees the red-coated figure and follows them, after which they're revealed to not be a child, but a dwarf. More to the point, they're the serial killer who has been mentioned to be terrorizing Venice, who then mortally wounds John with a meat cleaver. As John dies, he realizes that his visions were actually premonitions of his own murder and funeral, and that he was the victim all along. Duke Desmond in Salvage. Salvage follows Claire, a young woman who is brutally murdered by a man named Duke. At that moment, Claire wakes up at the convenience store where she was working prior to being killed, causing her to initially believe that she experienced a nightmare. Except Claire is eventually murdered again, forcing her to realize that she's trapped in a loop of experiencing her own death at Duke's hand. But at film's end, we're given the full context for this. For starters, Duke has not only killed Claire, but also her boyfriend Jimmy. And more to the point, Duke Desmond has actually been killed by the police and sent to hell, where his soul has since been inhabiting Claire's body, forced to relive her murder at his own hands for eternity as punishment. That's really messed up, even for a vicious murderer. Everyone in Death Watch. Death Watch is a rare war horror film taking place in the middle of World War I as a squad of British soldiers find themselves trapped behind enemy lines. The unit becomes lost in a fog-like haze before witnessing an increasingly bizarre and unsettling series of sights, such as compasses and watches no longer working, demonic growls in the distance, and corpses coming back to life. Clearly something untoward is in the German trenches beyond their mere battlefield enemies, and given that HQ announces over the radio that they believe the unit to have been killed in action, it's not that hard to see where things are going. Though the film's elliptical ending doesn't spell it out, it's a common reading that the British soldiers are all dead and have effectively been in purgatory for most of the movie, the content of their character being tested by their actions throughout the story. As for the German soldier who met the Brits at the start of the film and greets another batch of British soldiers at the end, he's often interpreted as a god or judge-like figure testing the soldiers. Either way, when the British soldiers entered those foggy German trenches, they had no idea what they'd presumably already suffered through. Scarlett and Chad in Farmhouse. Psychological horror Farmhouse centers around a young married couple, Scarlett and Chad, who moved to Seattle following financial strife and the death of their infant son. While driving, however, Chad falls asleep and crashes their car, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere near a, you guessed it, farmhouse. The farmhouse's owners, Sam and Lilith, allow Scarlett and Chad to stay the night, only to attack them and reveal that they plan to torture and kill them. Scarlett and Chad fight back, however, and eventually kill their captors before fleeing the farmhouse in Sam's pickup truck. When the truck runs out of gas and they take off on foot though, they inexplicably end up back at the farmhouse. Here, they're confronted by a miraculously still alive Sam and Lilith, who reveal that Scarlett and Chad died in their initial car crash and are now in hell. Satan then shows up and confirms that the couple are being punished for killing their son in order to collect life insurance money and pay off Chad's debts. Well, that's bleak. Satan does, however, do the pair a rather undeserved solid by giving them a second chance to, not murder their own son. However, the ending leaves it ambiguous as to whether or not they actually try raising him this time. If not, they'll be seeing Satan again soon enough. Philip Goodman in Ghost Stories. In Ghost Stories, skeptical Professor Philip Goodman is asked to investigate 3 supposedly real supernatural incidents. At the culmination of these 3 stories, we learn that Goodman is actually hospitalized, suffering from locked-in syndrome after a botched suicide attempt in his car. Basically, the 3 stories were all concocted by Goodman's consciousness from staff members and objects in his hospital room, usual suspect style, as well as his own guilt-riddled childhood, where he failed to save a tormented mentally disabled boy who died of an asthma attack. Ultimately, the doctors believe Goodman to be in a fully vegetative state, with no understanding of his surroundings, which evidently isn't true. The stories represent his brain's attempt to process both his guilt and what has happened to him, while not strictly acknowledging that he's actually confined to a hospital bed forevermore. Gretchen and Jack in Reeker. In Reeker, a group of young adults end up stranded in a desert oasis while being pursued by a grotesque, decaying creature. What initially appears to be a pretty typical down and dirty slasher flick eventually reveals itself to be more complicated than that though, when the ending reveals that the central characters were involved in a car crash which killed most of them. Earlier in the film, the group experienced a tremor on the road, and this actually marked the point at which their car was hit by an RV, killing all of the occupants except for Gretchen and Jack. From the tremor onward, the rest of the movie is effectively set in purgatory between the moment of the crash and the deaths of those on board, as the Reeker attempts to re-inflict the injuries from the car crash on the victims again, in turn confirming their deaths in the real world. And to top it all off, in the final scene, neither Gretchen nor Jack, who are now recovering from their injuries, have any memory of the accident or of their time in limbo.